here, Dan has really very distinguished 3 decade plus career working on tax and investment issues, founding and leading ITIC, having been executive director of the Tax Foundation, vice president and director of membership and Citizens for Sound Economy. Also in the past, it's really a very impressive background, and I think really well positioned to help a lot of emerging economies around the world as they think through their tax system. So we're really happy to have a chance to do this together today. And Dan, let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for going way back in my history to the mid '80s. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm delighted at the interest in Central Asia as we start to think about Christmas that we're all here today. Thank you to the Center for joining with us. Thank you, Microsoft, for this wonderful space. And I look out, I see Bill Courtney and Mark and Margarita, so many people that we've worked with over the years. I think about those early days. We'd meet at the fourth floor bar at the Dostik Hotel on Friday night. Anybody that was anything was at the Dostik, and here we are, 33 years later. So, and Cameron too, shout out to you. I want to be really brief, just to kind of share my views with the real simple conclusion. This part of the world matters. We go often, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years with different presidents, different administrations. And I feel like we have to run around trying to wake people up to the importance of Central Asia. And I believe where we're at today is a renaissance for U.S. Central Asia relations. Since Kazakhstan gave up their nuclear weapons, I don't think we've seen this part of the world toward the front of the president and the Secretary of State's desk. So for a good 30 years. And why I think it's important, and I'm not going to read the statistics, but you've got a population, an interesting population, nothing too big. You don't go there just because the domestic market is 92, 93 million people. GDP, just over $500 billion. Again, interesting domestic markets. Together, they're even more interesting. But as we move with the slides, this is where it becomes more interesting. The transit corridor, the Silk Road, which is becoming alive once again, the middle corridor, going from China to Europe without touching Russia. That's big. You've heard about it. I remember being in Tashkent 2 years ago, and a statistic about how the first shipment came from the Pacific to Europe across land, and it cut the transit time by almost 30 days. So, and then the last slide that I think is perhaps the most important, that I think the United States has finally woken up to, is the neighborhood. And if the C6, delighted that it's C6, if you look at who each of those countries touch, if we can strengthen our relationship with the 6 and put them in a better position to enhance their economic cooperation in trade with their neighbors, in many ways, I think they can do it better than us as we look at who the neighbors are. That will have a positive spillover to peace and geopolitical stability without even breathing those words. Economics and trade. And after the meetings on the 5th of November, I'm optimistic. I think the C5 and then quickly became the C6 plus 1 can become real. I think it can function as a real intergovernmental entity with the Secretariat. Hopefully that would be in Kazakhstan. Going back to that first slide, clearly Kazakhstan is the dominant economic player, but it needs to be strong and it needs to be anchored in trade and investment. And you think about that's the cable. Wouldn't call it a thread, the cable that unites the U.S. in Kazakhstan in Central Asia. And that's a cable now that's much deeper and stronger than just oil and gas. And my last point is why this, I believe, and I thought it was kind of a waste its time, for many years, the C5. And I was troubled by looking at the other organizations that these countries actively engaged in, that when Bill was the ambassador, some of these organizations were born. SCO, CIS, a little bit before, but the CSTO, and then BRICS, the Conference of Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. Crazy name, but they meet and they reinforce each other. And none of those organizations, and it's not by accident, do not welcome the U.S., not even as observers. So you look at what China and Russia are doing to engage on a regular basis on economics, trade, and security. I think we can say, following the 5th of November, America has shown up, and now all of us together, let's do our parts to push to make that real and strong. So Central Asia matters, and let's talk more about it, gentlemen and ladies.
Wow. This is the first time I've been on a panel with Dan. This dude is a tough act to follow.
No.
No, really. Welcome, everybody, here. I'm Andy Cutchins, a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest. I want to first note and thank Ariel Cohen, who approached me and Paul Saunders in October, a week or two before the C5+1 meeting, with the idea of doing this panel, which Paul and I thought was a good idea when he first approached us. And then when the C5+1 meeting took place on November 5th, we thought it was even a much better idea to do this and to bring more attention to it as we could. So Ariel, kudos to you. As some of you know, I spent a few years in the region fairly recently in Bishkek, where I was the president of the American University of Central Asia. And one of the most frequent questions that I got, especially from U.S. government officials, was, what are the interests of China and Russia in Central Asia? Do they coincide? Are they competitive, et cetera? And I answered with some kind of version like this. I said, well, Central Asians have been dealing with Chinese imperialism for more than 2,000 years. And in fact, the farthest west that Chinese got in Central Asia was in the 8th century in what is now Kyrgyzstan, where they fought the Battle of Talas, where the 40 tribes, the Kyrgyz, this was a great moment in Kyrgyz history, fighting together with Arabic and Muslim fighters of that time, they defeated the Chinese, and that's as far as China got. Central Asia also understandably views China very much as a rising power, and there's a lot of concern about how this could be threatening for their sovereignty. The Russians, on the other hand, while they've just been in the region for about 170 years, the middle of the last century. Now, of course, they came as colonizers, and so there's that part of the legacy. But the other part of the legacy is that the Russians really did a lot to modernize in a Russian imperial and then Soviet way in Central Asia, bringing literacy, industrial production, et cetera, et cetera. There remain a lot of strong historical, cultural, linguistic ties. Russia is not viewed so much as a rising power, maybe an unpredictable and dangerous power, but it's different from China. So but our speakers are going to discuss this in far greater detail. I'm going to briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and then we will have significant time for discussion, question and answers. We have a very good audience today, so I look forward to that. Our first speaker is Roger Kangas. Roger is the academic dean and professor of Central Asian Studies at the Near East South Asia Center, the NISA Center, a DoD regional center. Roger is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Roger is a senior fellow at the IISS in London. That sounds like a nice gig. And especially relevant for this week.
Yeah.
I want to note that Roger did his PhD at Indiana University.
Congratulations.
Who's your daddy?
Yes.
My son graduated from Indiana, and
Number
the
one.
first text he sent me after Indiana defeated Ohio State
Yep.
on Saturday night was, "Who's your daddy?"
Mhm.
So, congratulations to IU and their alums. It's a big win. Our second speaker is Ariel Cohen, very well known and highly regarded expert on energy policy, Russia, Eurasia, Eastern and Central Europe, and the Middle East. He's now a senior fellow at the International Trade and Investment Center and the managing director there of the Energy Growth and Security Program. And Ariel is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Our third speaker is Wesley Alexander Hill. Going by Wes, who's the assistant director and lead analyst with the Energy Growth and Security Program at ITIC. Wes is an expert on China, Eurasia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And especially this week, I want to note that Wes is a graduate of Tulane University. And he was a professor of political science there. And obviously, this is a good week for the Tulane Tigers. Sorry about that, Notre Dame and the Golden Domers. Not such a good week for you guys. Our last speaker is J.C. Lintvinich, who is the National Security Advisor to Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina. Yes? Yes. Where he provides counsel on defense, veterans, intelligence, foreign and security policy, and international relations. Before joining the Tillis team, he served as a senior advisor to the Director of National Intelligence, DNI. And JC is also a 28-year veteran of the U.S. Army. And looking at his biography, JC, you're a badass. Don't mess with him, okay? All right. Let me turn it over to you, Roger.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andy. And I should say the Indiana victory against that other state university. The last time they beat them, I was in graduate school. Happened to be at
1988.
Yeah, that was a while ago. So, and I should say, I had just come back from the region, from then the Soviet Union, and next year marks my 40th anniversary of traveling to Central Asia. So, it's sort of an interesting mark, and a lot of what both of you have said, I've seen, firsthand over time. I should also add, last night was my our final class at Georgetown, my geopolitics of Central Asia before their final. The map you showed prior to that, I showed that last night, the middle corridor.
Yes.
But it was a full capacity group, so I have confidence that the next generation of Central Asian aficionados are out there, and they are learning. It's fascinating. No, I'm honored to be included in this group, and I should say in this room. Quite a few of you sitting in front of me could easily be up here. So I do take this with some humility. And I'll also add that the remarks I make are my own, not that of the Defense Department, the U.S. government, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm really going to speak on the region itself. I'm going to defer the great power comments to my colleagues to my right on U.S., China, Russia. Um, so with that, I would say, when we look at the region, no surprise, it has been a subject of great power competition, so-called great power competition. Of course, there are a host of other countries interested. We could talk about different European states. We could discuss India, Iran, Turkey. I was recently in Oman and Singapore. Guess what? Both of those countries have a keen interest in Central Asia, sometimes for very specific matters, whether it's their question of food security, whether it's a question of technology transfers, of trade. And yes, corridor talk, whether it's east, west, north, south, draws the attention of a number of states. So I know we're going to speak really of the larger powers, and that's what's going to frame, our conversation this afternoon. Um, and I should say, as we look at these countries and the 5 states of Central Asia we see on the map, we can include Azerbaijan. I'm more than happy to do that. But I'm looking at the west of the Caspian or east of the Caspian. Um, Remind ourselves that it's 2025 and these are states with agency. And I know that's often a trite phrase or a trite way to say it, but when we discuss great power competition, often there's a concern of, devolving into activities of larger states with these pawns on a chessboard. We can think of the grand chessboard discourse of the last century. But these are countries that do act independently. They are concerned, and I know our colleagues in the audience today representing these countries understand this better than we do. They do understand the importance or value of these larger states, but we have to more and more think of the importance of what we see on this map. Traditionally, even in the worst discussions of great power competition, we never really spoke of taking over or acquiring territory. It's not about the physical control of nations, but rather which country or who can have the most influence in the region, and perhaps who can block out others. And I know that's going to be part of our conversation today. If country A is acting, could country B assert itself to prevent that from happening? Quite frankly, if we go back to the 90s, we didn't really see this because Russia, as much as we sometimes called the region Russia's backyard, they did not have the capacity to really engage with the region. They were busy with their own internal issues. But quite frankly, the Central Asians themselves were less concerned about geopolitics and more concerned about internal stability, the immediate neighborhood. We have a civil war in Tajikistan. We have a civil war in Afghanistan, a host of issues in the neighborhood. Um, it changes when we bring in resources. It changes when we start to bring in oil and gas, other commodities that are in this space. Suddenly, the outside actors go, wait, this is of interest to me. This could be an important space for us. And for those in the room who were around here in the late 90s, early 2000s, I don't think you could have gone a week, definitely 2 weeks, without some organization holding a conference on energy security, some external speaker coming in, some deal being made, an oil major deciding to explore in this space. This was common thought, right? It was the oil and gas world. No surprise, we start to, if you want to say, commodify our look at the region until the 2000s when we realize, there's a security value. And of course, from the American perspective, speaking as an American, we look at Afghanistan and the 20-year experience we had in that country and that NATO had in that country. Interestingly, for Washington, and for better or for worse, Central Asia in this security context was seen really as a conduit. It was a conduit for operations. It was not about control of Kazakhstan or control of Uzbekistan or control of Tajikistan. It was rather, how can these states help us in our operations further south? Sometimes it would entail partnerships. We had basing operations in the countries, overflight rights and others, from the period of 2001 to 2014. There were active U.S. military bases in the region, and this is what started getting some of the others interested in great power competition. The Russians were supportive initially of U.S. operations in Afghanistan. I know it's hard to remember that, but that was true. In fact, Mr. Putin was the first to call, and that is a talking point often of 2001 discussions. But in a few years, and maybe by 2006, 7, he had had enough. And of course, the notion of the U.S. having bases in Central Asia was not to his liking. Our friends in Beijing likewise raised concerns about the presence or the interference of non-hemispheric powers. A term of art I love to hear is like non-hemispheric powers. They must be discussing Bolivia or Canada. No, it was the U.S. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization repeatedly pressured Kyrgyzstan into shutting down the Manas Transit Center. Um, Quite frankly, I was surprised it lasted to 2014, and that was really it was a twofold. The Kyrgyz opinion, at least the Kyrgyz state, was frustrated with the basing situation there, and obviously there was a certain perception that they wanted to avoid. But likewise, the U.S. by 14 didn't need it as much, and in fact, when it shut down, operations went elsewhere. But this brings up the notion of competition over influence, competition over this space. Today, of course, we bring in this phenomena of critical minerals and other issues. And once again, we're going back into the commodity component, the economic competition of Central Asia. Well, how do the Central Asians respond to this? And I'll just offer a few thoughts and then close. Um, First and foremost, there is a reality of the region. It is a wonderful space, but it is also landlocked. Or I do like the phrase land linked, but that really depends on what you're looking at. It's a region that can be bypassed until we find one of these other regions, maybe swifter zones, cheaper zones, suddenly having problems. I'm thinking of the northern route. If we're thinking of the middle corridor, the northern corridor was the obvious advantaged route that suddenly becomes problematic for the Europeans. And so we start to think in terms of trade, transit in other areas. So the Central Asian states, and I would say in this particular instance, Kazakhstan, acknowledges that they need to look in other directions. It's not just this north-south trade route. Um, and it really underscores a policy that they've celebrated now for over 30 years, which is multi-vectorism, right? I mean, and again, all of you in the room are familiar with this, especially those of you who worked or served in Kazakhstan. They are traditionally held up as the example of this, but quite frankly, it's something that others have expressed as well in their policies, maybe not as overtly. But there's been an effort to not rely so heavily in one space. And we can take, for example, an immediate problem just off the map, which is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Um, Three Central Asian states are treaty allies of Russia, collective defense treaty allies through the CSTO, yet none have supported the forced acquisition of Ukrainian territory, nor openly volunteered military support or personnel in this endeavor. Um, this is a situation that has to be managed. And I think when we look at Central Asian states, and particularly Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, which do have certain obligations beyond what Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have, they've been able to walk a fine line. Even in UN General Assembly votes, in fact, walking through this, if you go, from the March 2nd, 2022 vote to the present, every time you see the roster of for and against resolutions and then the abstentions and absence, that's where you'll find our Central Asian states. And we can debate the nuances of being absent or abstaining, but the bottom line is they've decided not to voice their opinion on this. And it's interesting because, of course, were they to support Ukraine vocally, you'd have the concerns of what would this mean for us vis-a-vis Russia? You still have to put that in the back of your mind. Turkmenistan can rely on, the policy of positive neutrality. The other states, this is an overt decision. It's a decision to purposefully say we're not going to get involved in this conflict, but we're still going to engage in multinational organizations. We're still going to deal with this multi-vectored approach. You're right. You mentioned the organizations, and we can add the UN, the OSCE, the CSTO, the OTS. They're all party to NATO Partnership for Peace, even Turkmenistan. They've all decided to play a part in these organizations to varying degrees. And that's the interesting thing. They've given themselves exit in each of these opportunities. Um, CIS is a classic one. It's almost, you know, do you attend the meeting? If you attend the meeting, do you vote in the meeting? If you vote in the meeting, who do you send as your senior person? And it's almost like clockwork. If they decide to pull back, it's going to be a junior person showing up to observe and not vote. But the idea is you'll engage in these organizations, but not necessarily put your weight behind decisions that may have impacts in other areas. Um, and just, kind of as a final point on that, for any of these IOs, the Central Asians joined midstream. And this is a concern, quite frankly, for many countries in the world. You join the UN, you join another organization, but it's already been set up. The leadership structure's already been put in place. Voting has been put in place. They have had opportunities to be founding members, Organization of Turkic States. The SCO, we could think of three of them were members of the Shanghai Forum or Shanghai Five. Uzbekistan joins. The four of them collectively are part of the founders of the SCO. But like the Benelux countries with the EU, they find as there are new members brought in, maybe their voice isn't going to be as loud. When you have India and Pakistan and Iran now part of the SCO, perhaps you're not going to see this as really a vehicle for your action. So what do? You rely largely on bilateral ties. They're involved with multilateral organizations, support them, applaud them publicly, but I would also argue there's pressure to address issues bilaterally. And this, kind of the last comment, this gets us to the matters of Russia, China, the US. We're not going to deal with this in a competitive way, but in bilateral ways. So, when in the 2000s when Russia cuts off gas from Turkmenistan, or did a pipeline mysteriously get disrupted, third person. um, well, they turn to China. And of course, right now, over 30, BCMs of gas, goes to China. Turkmenistan makes a nice profit from this, but almost 90% of Turkmen gas is going to one source. And they would like to diversify, which is why we see the interest in TAPI, Trans-Caspian routes, et cetera. Even the meeting here, the U.S. hosted C5+1 head of state meeting, which was a success by all indicators. All presidents showed up, they met. But it's curious to note that when that meeting took place the other month, that we could see it as a culmination of a 10-year process. It was the 10th anniversary of the C5+1 discussion, so it's gone across administrations. And yet it's also important to note that even President Trump himself emphasized the bilateral agreements that were signed or promised. From the American side, the bilateral approach, U.S. Kazakhstan, U.S. Uzbekistan, U.S. Kyrgyzstan, these are going to be important. I'll also add that was the same in the region. If you look at the press coverage of it, yes, it's great to have a photograph of the collective. It's even more important to have a photograph of your president with the American president. You want to emphasize the bilateral element. So, we'll see this as we move forward, and I'll be curious what my colleagues have to say. Because just, to finish, 2025, what we do see are states that are stable, states that are challenging, if you want to say, limits of their export capacity or transit capacity. How can they develop their economies? They are all facing various problems. Being in this neighborhood, as you know, it's not a peaceful space. And so what routes are preferred? Which partnerships could be improved? And quite frankly, I do see one future is maybe less abiding by or putting your cards or your eggs, if you want to say, in the baskets of international organizations and collectives that include these broader neighbors, and focusing on the C5, now C6. And increasingly, we're seeing not just these meetings are being held and there are great photo ops, but decisions are being made. Decisions not on trade, but also decisions on collective security, or at least short of collective security. It's not going to be formalized, but it's going to be, in fact, ways in which they can work together, whether it's problems southward on whether it's transnational threats, concerns about Afghanistan, but also perhaps decisions on some broader security challenges. But for that, I'll close, Andy, and turn the microphone back over to you.
Thanks, Roger,
Okay.
for an excellent,
Okay.
thoughtful presentation.
Yeah.
Let's now turn to Ariel down on the
Mhm.
far wing uh, for a perspective to some degree on Russia's interests.
Thank you so much. Is this thing working?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
I want to thank the Center for the National Interest. We have not done joint events, and it's a pleasure working with Andy. It's great to be in this space. Your staff is terrific. And as the colleague said, there are a lot of expertise in this room, and I'm too happy to see Margarita and Kamran and Ambassador Courtney and others. I was thinking about how post-imperial spaces develop. My dissertation was on dissolution of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, but that was an empire dissolving. And there's a body of literature on what happens after. And 30 plus years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, ladies and gentlemen, the good news is in one generation, this region is acquiring agency. It's stuck to the multi-vector, multilateral policies that were formulated in the early 90s. The current president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, was a foreign minister who articulated these policies and started to implement that. We can laugh at Turkmenistan with a rotating golden statue, but that is, in the local parlance, a symbol of the region looking east, west, north, and south, as it did for thousands of years. But there are still concerns. When I started diving in what the Russian colleagues are saying about this region, they explicitly deny regional leadership. They say, and I'm referring to Ivan Safranchuk's group,
Yes.
ours out of MGIMO, they're saying after the Soviet Union collapse, Russia stepped in the fight de facto stabilizer. And they're taking the credit for keeping the region safe and stable. Yes, they did play a role in settling the horrible civil conflict in Tajikistan. They were invited by President Tokayev during the bloody events in January of 22 with a small interference with half of a brigade, 2,500 people. They reportedly did not take part in fighting, but it was an intervention by CSTO. And other scholars, Bardachov and others, are still articulating policy that you could say is neo-imperial or quasi-imperial. More disturbing are the propagandists. For example, an anchor on the state TV, and I stress it's state TV, it's 2025. Nothing is accidental in Moscow these days. And Sergei Mardan in October called for a raid on Astana and a cleansing operation, Zachystka, accusing Kazakhstan of aiding Ukraine via a drone attack on the Orsk refinery. He was not published, he was not sidelined. And in that particular broadcast, he said, yes, Russians are aggressors. He said that. Yes, Russians can be cruel and do not forget anything. Russians always come back for what is theirs. Chilling rhetoric indeed. I could also quote the late Tigran Kirsayan, the late husband of Margarita Simonyan, who also attacked Kazakhstan. But even when Mr. Putin was saying that Kazakhstan is a Russian-speaking country, President Tokayev answered to him, in Kazakh, and the whole Russian delegation was scrambling to put on the earphones for translation.
Yeah, that was priceless.
But you can see that the Russian attention to the region intensified after the invasion of Ukraine. You could argue that if the war in Ukraine is ended in what they perceive a victory, they would say they have a freedom of action elsewhere. And there is this great quote. I will translate it real quick. This is from um, an article where the authors write, in the general political aspect, Ukrainian crisis has an important and dual consequences. The fact of massive implementation of force for solution of foreign policy tasks puts the international and regional security in new conditions when countries in Central Asia should take into account Russian experience and correlate it with their own perspectives. This is a bone-chilling threat, and we cannot ignore it. Having said that, when you start looking at the numbers of Russian investment versus Chinese investment, Russia is on average twice as small, twice as weak as the Chinese investment. Chinese annual trade is over 90 billion. Russia is 44-ish billion. And of course, we, the United States, are at 7 billion. So we are way behind either Russia or China. Secondly, I think the Chinese are very smart because they see themselves primarily as an economic actor, and they outsource security, which is a net loss activity, to Russia. What they're not doing, I think, is letting Russia dominate television broadcasting, culture, and to a great degree, education. So a lot of folks in Central Asia, if the families are not rich, if they don't want to send them to UK, US, or elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the West, they may send them to a Russian school in their country, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or to Russia, and where it becomes a real soft power issue is in the security and defense. The majority of people in the security and defense establishments are still getting their education in Russia.
And orders.
When the war, the big invasion of Ukraine happened, we started looking at sanction evasion. And there you do see a lot of companies sanctioned efforts by governments, including Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, trying to stop more blatant evasion. But still, for example, I have a report here of all the space in warehouses in Kyrgyzstan taken by dual-use technology that was re-exported to Russia. Some of the industrial zones in Uzbekistan assembling computers or re-exporting microchips to Russia. So that is a real concern. At the same time, the United States is interested in expanding its engagement with rare earths, with AI, data centers, you name it, uranium. So we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater by being too punitive, but we need to understand that some of these countries are under a lot of pressure from Russia to facilitate their economic realignment and readjustment due to sanctions. Energy plays a huge role. You see Russia signing an agreement for a large VBR reactor in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan also signed an agreement with China for another reactor. But these are multilateral, multinational programs. I was in Kazakhstan recently and had conversations with the nuclear regulatory agency there and with Kazatomprom, and they're saying that for the reactor, there will be French, German, and other companies that will play a role in building that ecosystem. So it will not be only the Russian reactor itself. In Uzbekistan, these are Russian small modular reactors, but the question mark is financing. Russia had a contract for building power stations, thermal power stations in Kazakhstan, didn't come up with the financing, and the contract was rescinded. Russia, for a long time, tried to block Turkmenistan exporting gas to countries other than China. Now there were some swaps with Turkey and with Europe via Russian pipelines. But the key project, the Trans-Caspian pipe, is still not happening. And that would be very desirable to diversify European natural gas supply, because Turkmenistan has so much gas. And they could, with a short interconnector with the Taptanab system, the Azerbaijani system, and export it west, not only east, and not only in to Iran. The building of the multilateral organizations, including CSTO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, these are all more or less traditional geopolitical, geoeconomic tools to keep the region in the Russian orbit, and with, of course, with Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the Russian-Chinese orbit. The question is the United States engaged sufficiently to make it truly multilateral? And I would say what the folks in the region are looking for is a strong signal from Washington to follow up on the C5, now C6 photo op in Washington. And that's the first ever visit by the sitting U.S. president in the region. I think Bill Clinton was there after he got out of the office. And yes, Andy, I am going to wrap up. Just to illustrate this point, I had a list of Putin's visits to the region, and he is there all the time. He, where is this? Okay, I lost it. He signed the alliance with Turkmenistan. He recently, President Tokayev stopped in Moscow on the way from Washington, and they signed the elevated strategic partnership and alliance. Putin was in Dushanbe several times, supervising the Afghan border, which is very, very problematic, with ISIS Khorasan sitting there on the Afghan side. So Russia is paying attention. There's also an undercurrent of racism inside of Russia that is poisoning the people-to-people relationship. When you travel in the region, people complain how they're treated in Moscow. But overall, the Russian commitment for security, for engagement in coordination with China is there. There's also competition with China. And it remains to be seen if the two great powers there remain in sync as they were so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Just a very brief anecdote to accentuate what you're saying about soft power. Putin was in Kyrgyzstan about 10 days ago, and when Chapatov was speaking with them, what they showed live is, of course, Chapatov is speaking in Russian, quite good Russian, but one thing that he said that struck me was Kyrgyzstan is a member of the Russian world, which well, it was kind of quite a contrast to the incident you were mentioning with Mr. Tokayev and the Russian elites. I think
And I don't
last
think
summer,
Mr.
spring.
Mirziyoyev would say something like that.
No. Okay, let's turn it to you, Wes.
All right. Thank you very much. So it's always very difficult to go in the middle of such an esteemed panel. So I've decided to leave an impression on you guys with a few images, some maps, and hopefully if my
We like
speech
that.
utterly fails to get your attention, you'll at least have some pretty images to remember me by.
Pictures.
Yes, exactly. So I'm going to be talking about China in Central Asia, but I'm not just going to be talking about what Central Asia means or what China means in Central Asia. I'm going to talk about China and Central Asia as a bellwether for Chinese foreign policy, how China looks at the region, and what it means for the international system as a whole. So I have 4 maps up there. I could have easily filled the slide with 10 to 20. I just honestly picked my 4 favorite dynasties. And you'll notice something about every single Chinese political entity on the map. The top left, you see the Han, then the Sui in the top right, Tang bottom left, and Ming bottom right. What happens every time there is some sort of Chinese political entity? It consolidates the core of China, the areas you think of, Beijing, Shanghai, the major rivers, etc. And then what does it immediately do after? Does it consolidate the rest of what we think of as modern day China? Does it go into Manchuria? No. Does it even get all of those hard to govern mountains in the south or southwest in Tibet? No. It immediately walks west. It goes down the Gansu Sea corridor into modern day Xinjiang, and then it keeps going west into modern day Central Asia. This is what we call in the West the Silk Road. And I often asked students when I was still teaching, and I, occasionally challenge interns, what do you think the Silk Road was? And most people give a sort of generic answer. Oh, it was, people on camels. They went and got silk. They took glass from the West. It was trade. It was globalization. Well, if you were a Chinese emperor or a local ruler in Central Asia, your answer might have been much different. Your answer might have been that, oh, the Silk Road was a purposeful political and military project that China wanted to use to export surplus goods to the West. And I'm going to make the case today that even though the specific circumstances have changed a lot, that this East-West interaction between Central Asian states and China is pretty much the default. So Professor Kangas sort of stole my thunder by mentioning this earlier, but the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of North-South interaction, where Russia as a political entity, first the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, is involved in Central Asia, that is not the default. But even during the 19th and 20th centuries, we saw incredible changes and interactions between the peoples of Central Asia and China. The largest mass migration in the Cold War that happened was people desperately trying to leave Xinjiang after the events of the Great Leap Forward, and 2 PLA officers attempting a coup that ultimately failed. But then they led 60 to 80,000 people over the course of 3 months, 4 months in 1962, 1963, from China into the Soviet Union. So this is an almost totally unknown event in the West. And I hope I'm bringing this up not just so that you learned an interesting factoid and you can go search this up on your own, but so that I can recontextualize a little bit about how this region is interacting. There is both settled state interactions. There is Russia and Soviet Union at this time, China, all of the local states, etc. But there is also incredible movement of goods, commerce, and ethnicities throughout time that I hope everyone will remember and factor into considerations. So this is just an interesting poster. I'll leave that up there. But Maoism, the enemy of Marxism, Leninism, and Soviet soldiers, never forget this wild Chinese brood is only 6 miles away. These are both found on the Tajik border with China, a few miles away. So what is China doing now, and what does this all mean? Well, I would like to contrast what China is doing actually with what Russia is doing. So the Chinese ambassador to France was giving a public interview, and he made a blunder and a really, really nasty pun. And I'll try to explain the pun. He said these 5 so-called post-Soviet states. Well, in Chinese, if you know Chinese, you would so-called, if you have the number 5 before it and you drop a character in between, it sort of means like very dismissive, like, oh, it's no big deal. So these states that are no big deal. And immediately what China did was this man was sacked and he was promoted to a broom closet. Now, I contrast this very heavily with he was promoted to a do-nothing job. I contrast this specifically with Russian threats. Say, former president of Russia, current professional Twitter troll Dmitry Medvedev, saying that, maybe a few nuclear strikes at Kazakhstan would be okay. Maybe it's an artificial state, etc. China takes the state interactions and elite level interactions with these states much more seriously than Russia does. And unlike Russia, which is really bound up in lots of different multilateral organizations, China is very much invested in these bilateral relationships. So yes, China does have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is a member of many different organizations that involve Central Asian states. But when you look at breakthrough agreements with, say, Turkmenistan to purchase lots of gas, or the China-Uzbekistan-Kyrgyzstan Railway, or any of these other things, the Chinese do it on a bilateral basis. Now, where does Central Asia factor into Chinese foreign policy, and why is this so important? Well, we focus a lot when we're talking about Chinese territorial aggrandizement on the South China Sea, Taiwan, islands off the coast of Japan, and between the two, and to a lesser extent, Korea. Well, China historically only takes these actions when it feels like its western and northern flanks are secure. And if you know anything about Chinese history and the Mongols and the Huns and all of these other groups, and then later on its hostility with the Russians, this sort of makes sense. But so what China is doing, and what this is an indication of, is that it feels like Central Asia and Russia are not going to trouble it if China wants to take actions elsewhere. It feels like this flank is mostly secure. However, there is some tentative evidence that this is changing. So the traditional analysis that has dominated understandings of Russian and Chinese involvement in Central Asia the last decade or so has been China is economic and Russia is security. And that is still true today. What appears to be changing is that China is more and more open to political and security ties, and they are more and more scared that Russia is going to do something drastic or uncontrollable in Central Asia. So when Dmitry Medvedev said that Kazakhstan was artificial and who would care if it was nuked, China immediately the next day had its foreign minister say, we recognize the territorial integrity of all post-Soviet states that came about in 1991. When Russia was making noise about renegotiating the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, China said that it was now in talks with Kazakhstan so that it could have, some sort of security training and guarantees aimed specifically at the western part of Kazakhstan, the western edges of Chinese interest in the many oil and gas fields in the region. So China and Russia are not yet competing in a way that we see Russia competing with the West or the West competing with China with each other in the region. But I think even though that competition is not yet here, I think we're likely going to see a ratcheting up of this competition. Why? Well, unless Russia manages to really pull off a currently, I think, very unlikely military victory that justifies all of the losses that they've endured in Ukraine, they're going to be looking for consolation prizes. And what is the biggest consolation prize around? Well, it's Kazakhstan to their south. They have made no secret about their hostility towards Kazakhstan. They have made no secret that they can get something out of Kazakhstan, and they are trying, and they are very open about their ambitions. So for China, it now has this strategic dilemma. On one hand, Russia is a very useful asset. It is very useful because Russia causes problems in Europe. Russia attracts all this attention. Russia is unpredictable. It's aggressive. And it's very tempting for China to sort of lean back and let Russia attract all the attention because, unlike Russia, which has demographic and economic problems that I don't need to elucidate too deeply on, I think, China has. Sure, it has demographic problems, has economic problems, but there is no fundamental, long-term, insurmountable obstacle or nearly insurmountable obstacle, the same way that we would see with Russia. On the contrast, though, China is also worried about Russia benefiting from the Chinese security umbrella, benefiting from Chinese arrangements, economics, etc., to grow a lot more powerful. So, for those of you that are historically minded, as I am, China kind of views Russia as sort of how Germany viewed Austria-Hungary. They're shackled to a corpse. That is what one PLA representative to the Standing People's Congress said, or the Consultative Congress said a year and a half ago about their increasing relations with Russia. So Russia is seen as moribund, but useful, powerful, but not really directable. And all of this points back to Central Asia, who for China has more utility and more use than just beyond the relationship with Russia, which I've contrasted it with and focused on, because there is the Silk Road. There is a transit route to the west. So going west overland, China also has the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It has increasing influence in Afghanistan, and it has an influence with Iran, even though that influence has been degraded since the Iranian-Israeli war that happened earlier this year, because Iran was somewhat disappointed in China's response, but its influence is still there. So for China, overland to the west represents one massive strategic asset. It represents a way of trading and routine economic activity that the United States Navy cannot interdict. Currently, you have one American carrier group. If you wanted to cause a lot of damage and risk, certainly start World War III, you could have them choke off a 40, 50 miles straight, the Straits of Malacca, and you'd cut off 80% of Chinese exports that go through the South China Sea around Malaysia in between Indonesia. China is very well aware. China looks at the historical, the track record of land powers confronting naval powers, and it desperately wants to find some way around that. An overland trade route that connects to Central Asia, connects to Iran, Pakistan, and then maybe Europe, depending on how European-American relations shape out in the next few years, is in China's best interest. Is all of this a substitute for other Chinese projects in the South China Sea or Taiwan? No. Will China be satisfied if it gains some sort of political victory in Central Asia versus these other parts of the world? I don't think so. But what we should view Central Asia for in Chinese foreign policy, it's a bellwether. If China thinks the region is locked down, it's satisfied with the arrangement, it will be more aggressive elsewhere. If you see China being more concerned about Central Asia and increasing competition with Russia, there's going to be more activities, and there's going to be more focus on that region compared with, say, Taiwan or these islands, in between China and Japan, et cetera. So
Wes?
I will end with one final point. Thank you very much for indulging me being a little bit over time, to say that China is very cognizant of this dynamic in its foreign policy, and it is working, and it has worked so far somewhat successfully in de-risking and deconflicting with Russia in Central Asia. But it appears that Russia is the one that is overturning the apple cart in this regard. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry for running a little bit over.
That was a terrific presentation, Wes.
Good perspective.
Okay, JC, floor is yours.
All right, is this?
Yep.
Okay. So the good news is I'll probably get us back on time. So that's one of the beauties of going last in these kind of things. I have my notes and then I hear everything and I change everything around. So, but you know, of course, the disclaimer up front, these are my own views, not the boss's views, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like my colleague there. Um, so, this region matters, and I'll give you probably the greatest prioritization. And I had to make this decision this morning. It was discuss this region of the world or meet Gene Simmons from Kiss. So
Ooh.
true story is you saw is kind of the boss is hosting an IP hearing today and Gene Simmons is testifying. So I chose foreign policy in this region. So
You're a
that
Ace Frehley got an award. Another KISS member got an award in the White House.
yeah, that was the three of them were there.
Yeah.
For,
Is it still going on? We could go.
yeah. All right, everybody. No, but
There's Spotify and
we could all put on our makeup up here, but no, but all seriousness,
Kiss cover band.
this region of the world is absolutely critically important. So you look at the timing of things that were already discussed, the meetings at the White House. I was over at Milano one night, and one of the delegations came in all over town. I think that's a very positive thing. Not only the White House meeting, but these sessions, you are seeing a proliferation of awareness and engagement across the board. So I tend to go in more point order than soliloquy like my academic colleagues here. So I think that's, an indicator as well as that you'll see. But now you look at the timing of where you look at, we're now coming off of a fairly policy weekend of the rollout of an NSS, Reagan National Defense Forum, both of which I've gone through. I'm still going through 3,000 pages of the NDAA, so you might catch me today on one or two things in there. So with that, that's just kind of frame what I'd like to try to do today is look at a more strategic lens at things as we go through here. Like one of the colleagues said, you all are the experts in this. And one of the great things about these sessions is as I go around, one of my responsibilities on the Hill is continue to learn from everybody as well. So with that, I think for years we discussed Central Asia, the CAS, it's been peripheral to everything else. What we're seeing in this moment in time in the engagements, that's no longer the case, and it's for multiple reasons. You look at my time in Afghanistan, what was everything about? It was about the air corridor. It was movement in or out. It was not so much transactional, but it was one issue. We're now seeing the evolution of issues to touch on trade, resource, competition, you name it. This region touches it all. So where we're at, it's a historic sine wave. And I think, for a while, Silk Roads, we touched on that, World Wars, for the past, I would say, couple decades, the global sine wave was fairly standard. The trade partnerships were set, military alliances were set, economic, all the talking heads going around, things were set. What you're seeing now on multiple fronts, and some of it's this administration, some of it's realities, you're seeing changes in lots of dynamics, regional alliances, the change of technologies that are out there. When we talk about rare earth minerals and all these things, those things don't occur for the sake of just palladium. There's a reason that's needed. It's needed because of advances in technology, greater demands. So there's a supply and demand aspect of that's changing around the world. So with that, he who or she who controls a lot of this stuff, energy, pipelines, infrastructure is key. So we're seeing that right now as well. So you see that in the decisions that are being made in the Central Asian states, but there are other pockets similar to that as well. You see Central and Southeastern Europe have some of the same issues that they have to contend with. So as you look around the world, you're seeing similar pockets of issues. So what do I see as from the U.S. foreign policy role here? It's really the economic. Everyone's familiar with that DIME model, even though there's more to it than just four letters. I've used midlife in the past. That we find ourselves in a stage where the M, to the chagrin of of lots of people in DCDM is not the most important thing in this region. We're expanding on the D, but it's the economic, the infrastructure. As the maps have shown there, I think in the sine wave, we're being reminded that the world, not just the internet connecting people, but the Eurasian landmass is still somewhat contiguous. Pipelines, trains, where, rail gauges and such that we talked about as a military mobility issue in Europe now also matter to cross-continental movement of goods, value, and all that. So this is something that I think will stabilize things. It's not so much the military stabilization, it's the economic stabilization and the infrastructure. So with that, countries have a choice, and this is where we get into the competition model. China and Russia, and I'll pick on China for a second. Many countries, be it in this region, Africa, Europe, would love to partner with the United States as the first choice. The problem is we're slow, we're bureaucratic. China is quick on the dime, and they're cheap. So sometimes that competition model, we get in our own way. So we're working through that. But what I would say to a lot of our partner nations is sometimes you get what you pay for. So there's a frustration in dealing with the United States at times in laws and bureaucracy and policy. But when you build a bridge, when you build infrastructure, you know, I'm a Balkans kind of guy. I'm not, when you build a train station in Serbia, you want to make sure it doesn't collapse with all your people on it. So I would say that is a key thing about setting standards out there in partnership for the region. That is key. So we're moving forward. We already touched on, we're 10 years old, really, with some of these key partnerships. So in foreign policy land, we're past the terrible twos and we're into our teen years in this. And this is where I think is key, where we can go one direction for those of you with most probably have kids. Now we're getting into that phase of this foreign policy, economic relations. Where does this go? Where does it shape itself out? And from that perspective, we're starting, to see this as well, over 25 billion in U.S. investment already in there. And we're growing the part, not just U.S. government, but lots of private industry is starting to move in. So that sensitization is already taking place. I would say legislatively, and a lot smarter than me, but changes in legislation, Jackson Vanik and some of the other things, Congress is not quick. Okay, there's keeping the government open, but I think it's a positive sign that that type of discussion is occurring in different committees out there. So that's another key, that evolutionarily, that as we go into this phase of the teen years, you have legislative books, if you will, that are starting to take place. So I think we're evolving, and where this is going is the United States, where we partner, recognizing, China and Russia. Russia will just kind of leave at this, but our competition with China being primarily, economic. Hopefully, we don't get there militarily with them, but it's how do we maintain that balance? And this is something that obviously, with China on the doorstep, that is something the region has to deal with. The reality of how do you balance a relation with countries that are your physical neighbors. But also, we have the same issue, and I often say this: we want to continue to buy crap from China. We just can't buy critical. So as we don't buy critical, the minerals, and we have to look. This is where the friendshoring, solid investment, going down the rabbit hole from uranium to all the different pieces. That is where that matches up with U.S. industry, and looking at those relations again, the supply and demand as the ability for the United States and our allies to execute production of key materials, not being dependent on China, but it's looking at for what those other partners and develop in relation. This is where some of the economic statecraft comes in, and being able to bolster that, under no illusion that we will probably ever sever the relation of countries that abut and share borders with other competitors. But it's really that. It's a competition. How do we offer that best offer and make the juice worth the squeeze? We've discussed it, that continuous system is there. And as the Eurasian landmass opens up, we talk about pipelines and all that, but interconnection to the Adriatic and so forth, we as a country risk, missing out, which is important because if you're not in the game, you become irrelevant. So the challenge, I think, going back to policy, is how we prioritize. Again, critically important region. You still got a war in Ukraine going on. We are still need to be mindful of a rising China. So how do we balance all that? You have an NSS that looks one direction. You have NDAA that potentially signals another thing. So that's not all bad. Neither is right or wrong. That's where decision makers now have to craft the way ahead with the reality with our partners on the ground. So I think, to kind of close up here, this competition is a key word. The Central Asian states are clearly back on the radar. The sine wave of history has changed a little bit. And really now, as we go into this next decade, that that I think is uncharted as we, go into the tail end of our teen years. So we probably want more time for, questions and answers, but that's just my thoughts, listening to my colleagues and, a few things rattling around my head.
Thanks, JC. That was terrific. And thanks to all the panelists. All the contributions were really terrific. Now I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question of the panel. And I'm inspired because I see one of my former students from AUCA in the crowd, Abdul Ali Esmailzada, who's from Afghanistan, a country that has not been mentioned and certainly is part of what one would consider a greater Central Asia. Actually, our Afghan students, they comprised about 10% of the student body at AUCA. They were the best students at AUCA. They had a grade point average of half point higher than the rest of the rest of the student body. Of course, Afghanistan's a big country, and so the competition for these slots was very, very competitive, was very intense. So we've talked about U.S., Russian, Chinese perspectives on Central Asia. I'd like to ask you to put Afghanistan into the mix and where you see it fitting. Whoever wants to start first, we can go in order. Okay, Roger, or we can go.
Okay, so we can go in order. Yeah, it's interesting because, in July of 2021, Uzbekistan hosted a connectivity conference in Tashkent and Samarkand. And the emphasis was the C5, the five Central Asians, connecting with Afghanistan. In fact, you're right. Often the phrasing C6 was the inclusion of Afghanistan into the other five. There was obviously a lot of stress surrounding it because of what was happening in Afghanistan. But the fact that Mirziyoyev is there and others are there present, I mean, it was like 40 some different nations represented in this meeting of various academics and policy people. But the goal was looking at regional connectivity. And in some ways, that's, it's one of these bugs in amber moment, because if you take that, and of course, a month later, you have the collapse of the Ghani government, the departure of the NATO forces and others, Afghanistan has taken a very different turn. But the interest is there. And I would say one development over the last 20 plus years has been a certain caricaturized view of Afghanistan in the late Soviet period, and sort of there having, classmates or friends who were being drafted into the Soviet army, and then they would have to fight there. This was something they didn't want to do, and there was a certain, perception of going to this, wild, chaotic place. But because of the connections over the last 2 decades of Afghans going to universities in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, a more aggressive trade program between the countries. I mean, I would see trade from Afghanistan into Uzbekistan in particular. There's a certain knowledge of the country that people are trying to come to terms with. How do we engage with Afghanistan and yet factor in this phenomena of a Taliban-led government that none of them recognize? And so I would say from a Central Asian perspective, it is this cautious, pragmatic engagement. There are still person-to-person ties. Kazakhstan, I believe, is still sponsoring Afghan students in their country, funded students, I should say, or their funding. But others are still trying to look at cross-border. The Turkmen have done this at least with 2 different border crossings. The Tajiks, at least 3. The Uzbeks, of course, have the Friendship Bridge. They're looking at trans-Afghan projects, not just TAPI, but rail lines and others. So there's this hope that the things discussed in the summer of 21 could still come to fruition. They just have to jump that hurdle of how do we work with the Taliban. The fact that Russia recognized them caused everyone's ears to perk up. My personal view, we're the Chinese to do this and say formally, we recognize the Taliban. The Central Asians may decide to jump in the water, or they may decide, you know what, we're just going to keep it as it is right now. And it's this, what I would call cautious pragmatism in engaging.
Yeah.
Actually, Ariel and I were there. Number one, we were delighted.
Yeah.
It was our first big trip post-COVID. But it was interesting and extremely disappointing at the low-level participation by the U.S. They sent an assistant to the president for Homeland Security, where you had the president of India, Prime Minister Khan, the president of Afghanistan, the heads of state from the region, and we had a non-Senate confirmed White House staffer. That says it all. But I was batting where JC was in the batting order, and after a long-winded panel chaired by the former head of EBRD, I got up and with no time left, I said, I've got 3 points, and I think they're relevant today. Build the railroad. $500 million is peanuts. Number 2, create a real regional economic community. Forget about the grand aspirations. Eliminate cross-border impediments to trade. And number 3, digitalize tax and customs administrations so the revenue goes to the state and not corrupt criminals. And I sat down, and I think it's still true today. And again, the economic cables that can unite. I mean, you can get the bad guys, pay them for security, the way they protect pipelines in Nigeria, in Chad. You can bring the bad guys in off the opium fields to protect a railroad. A lot of good things.
So, Dan, when you made those 3 points, did you get a standing ovation?
Yeah, because we weren't going overtime.
Anybody else want to comment on this, or we turn?
Ariel was there.
Okay.
Yeah, it was an eerie conference in 21 because the president of Afghanistan was there and the then prime minister of Pakistan, and he publicly humiliated Ashraf Ghani. And I thought, Ashraf Ghani is a political corpse walking. I understand that. What I didn't realize that what's his name?
Khan.
Imran Khan.
Imran Khan was on his way out as well. So within a couple of months, they both are gone. On Afghanistan, it's you know the expression, the Chekhovian rifle. In a drama, if the rifle in Chekhov's drama, rifle is on the wall in the first act, somebody takes it in the third act and kills somebody. I think this is what ISIS-K is. That sooner or later, those people will spring out of wherever the caves they're sitting in and, God forbid, attack Tajikistan. And then what? And then who gets involved? Do the Chinese get involved? Or the Russians get involved? Because we probably are not going to get involved there. So it is a concern. The other thing is, Kamran and I recently were looking very carefully at a perspective of the southern corridor all the way to the ports on the Indian Ocean. And it's kind of, we're not there just yet. It would be nice to diversify the routes out of Central Asia, to go to Gwadar and to go to Chabahar. But the political risk barriers are so difficult that Everybody needs to work on that. Somehow, sometime in the future, maybe the sanctions on Iran will lift, and then we can build something, a railroad to Chabahar, or the I don't know, the regime in Kabul will evolve or will be changed to something more benign, and then we can build that railroad to Gwadar. But for now, unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Okay, oh boy,
Fantastic.
you know,
Fantastic.
we have a hard stop at 2 o'clock, I'm afraid to say. But Paul, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Kamran. And we'll take
Just
three, then
have
we'll go
like
to
one or two
Ali.
people
Okay.
answer. So, having read the administration's national security strategy, I'm a little bit envisioning, an administration official sitting here saying, "Well, yes, this all sounds very important, but shouldn't the Europeans take the lead?" So I guess I'm wondering, and maybe just one or two people on the panel, are the Europeans capable of that, and what are the implications for the United States of taking that view?
Okay, hold on to that. The Russian answer is no, the Europeans are not capable. But Kamran.
Thank you. I just want to build on what Paul said.
Sorry, could you just identify yourself for the
Yeah, Kamran Bukhari, Senior Director, New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. I just want to build on what Paul said. So there is the NSS that has come out. There are also certain realities that we're going to have some form of a deal, hopefully, with the Kremlin at some point. This war can't go on forever and ever.
Agreed.
The Russians will take a long time to get out of their malaise, the economic malaise that they've dug themselves in. The Chinese are rising, but there's also a lot of fault lines within that country. We continuously hear of purges by Xi of PLA and now CCP people. The economy isn't doing too well. Iran is oscillating on a wavelength that is not sort of comprehensible. Something has to give there as well. And so, in the light of all of this, I'd love to hear how does all of this change things for Central Asia? Because it's right smack in the middle. So yeah.
Okay. Actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to collect a bunch of comments, and questions, and I would appreciate if you could all be as brief as possible, and then we'll give each panelist a shot to close things out. Ali.
Thank you. Thank you so much for time. My name is Ali, and I'm currently with American Institute for Economic Research as a research fellow. Formerly involved at C5+1. My question, I have a very few questions, like small questions.
Just one.
Okay, so since I did the U.S.-China relations, trade disputes, my question is, what's the U.S. Strategic advantage when it comes to critical minerals and strategic diversity, given the China's strategic advantage in the region? Thank you.
Great question. Okay, we'll go to Scott and then to Mark and then come over here. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Scott Worden, U.S. for USIP on C5+1 issues. This administration seems like it has a unique capability to break molds and try bold new things. And when we look at the numbers that Ariel mentioned, I can't quote them, but 40 billion investment by China, 20, and then 6 for us.
95 China, 44 Russia, 7 for us.
So is there any, what are your views on whether the administration can somehow, make a multi-billion-dollar investment to try to get that gap up? And what would you point that investment toward if you could?
Mark Miller from Trade Bistro Advisory. Ariel mentioned post-photo op progress. I think one area could be the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. I got a lot of positives. We are in a unique position to have a parliamentary aide on the panel, so I'd be curious as to his views. But the only of the C6 nations, the only nation that is not subject to the Jackson-Vanik restrictions is Kyrgyzstan. So I know everybody would love to see progress on it, especially since it is effectively a non-issue.
Sort of a non-issue issue. Yes, sir.
Hi, John Mann with Montfort Eurasia.
Gonna give
Um,
everybody a chance.
I guess it follows along a little bit with what was said earlier, but I was curious. Earlier this year there was a C5+1 summit with the European Union in Samarkand, and you also have the Gulf Cooperation Council. There's supposed to be a GCC summit also in Samarkand, which got canceled at the very last minute. I'm curious as to what you guys think. The EU and the GCC, how much are they a part of this multi-vector foreign policy for the C5? And how much of a balance are they to the U.S. and to China and Russia? I mean, if you go out to Tashkent or Almaty right now, you see a lot of Saudi investment coming in.
Yeah.
So the GCC is really making a push into the region. And of course, the EU as well. The French are out there doing uranium and oil and gas as well. So it's what's the balance there?
Okay. Right here, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. My name is Abdullah. I'm a former diplomat of Afghanistan. I will try to keep it very short, sir. I have a comment on Mr. Roger, and I have a very quick question as well. I also heard that some people have served in Afghanistan. I want to say thank you very much, and we will remain grateful regardless of what happened in Afghanistan. Our generation will be grateful for all the services that the United States and other international community did. My comment, sir, you said that President Putin and some other leaders in the region welcomed when the United States came to Afghanistan after the collapse of the first Taliban. That might be publicly or officially, but there are people that they believe that from the very early years, when developments were happening in Afghanistan, the media was booming, parliament was forming, and there was a new constitution and women associations and all, Afghanistan was succeeding. Some of the strategies from the region, they sit down together and said, what is the next? Then they discussed on three scenarios. The first one, they said that, okay, it is an opportunity. There is a new government. The radicals, the religious Talibans and fanatics are gone, and let's help them. And then said, okay, in that case, it will be a functioning, developing, and a well-working state in our neighborhood, which increases the desires of copying in the region. And then they said that, okay, then the second scenario was, okay, let's try to revitalize the Taliban again. And then again, they said, okay, then there will be radical Sunni Islamists in our neighborhood, and that will be a threat to us in Central Asia and also in Iran and in other parts. So the third scenario, which was chosen, some people believe that, okay, let's help both sides. From one side, we eliminate through to NATO some of the radical religious extremists, and from the other side, we change Afghanistan new government to a failing and malfunctioning state, and no one will desire to copy. So that was also one of the scenario. But my question is, sir, in the early days, there was a huge strategy or big three strategy of the three big players in the region, the BRI and CPAC of China and the Euro-Asia of Russia. And in 2010 and 11, the United States raised the issue of new greater Silk Route.
The question, please.
The question is this one, that is there any appetite or desire again to regional connectivity, connecting Central Asia through to Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was very interested in those days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry for being a little bit longer.
Right here. Last question, comment.
Thank you. My name is Anatoly Motkin, president of a strategy center for a new economy. So 20th century was about the physical infrastructure. 21st is about digital infrastructure. And I think that without securing the US digital or technological supremacy in the region, all our discussions here will not have any connection to reality in 2-3 years. We have an example of Lithuania that recognized Taiwan, and now it's removed from any list in any Chinese port. Who knows what will frustrate them next, right? So how we could secure American technological supremacy in the region?
Okay. Everybody, we're going to start from the far end and come here, and each of you has 1 minute So obviously you can't reply to everything, but what is your final? Ariel.
I will take the question that is asking where to invest in Central Asia. I would say that the smart people are learning from the mistakes of other people. We should learn from the Chinese BRI version 1.0 when a lot of investment went sour, went awry. We need to look at bankable investment. We heard the other day in a closed meeting, I think she is executive vice president of Exim Bank, who said the Exim Bank will take an equity position when will provide loans when equity positions are clear and capital is committed. U.S. does not do business the same way the Chinese do, although under the Trump administration we see equity acquisition by the state for the first time in maybe ever. Coming from the Soviet Union myself, or born in the Soviet Union, I deeply detest state capitalism, but maybe in some national security exceptions, the state can take equity positions to mine rare earths, for example. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Having said that, when the bankable projects are prepared in mining, in processing, in rare earth space, China is dominating 70, if I remember correctly, 70% of mining and close to 90% of melting and processing. Is that correct, Wes?
It's higher, depending on how you measure. It's around 90.
So this is crucial. This is front and center on President Trump's desk, and it's a great priority. Kazakhstan, for example, already signed, I believe, $17 billion of memorandum of understanding, and there will be work done to follow up and do it. 4.2 billion for locomotives, 8 billion for Boeing aircraft, just in the recent summit. So we're playing catch up. If it's 7 billion versus 90 plus billion China, 40 some billion Russia, we have to play catch up. As far as Europe,
Wait,
yeah, Europe
your
is
minute's
not there.
done.
Europe is not there yet.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry, JC.
All right, I'm going to try to hit all of them in 1 minute. So the digital piece.
No, you're not.
Oh yeah. So what I would say to the question on infrastructure, it's all about standards and the equipment manufacturing. You choose China or you choose the more European U.S. focus. And as far as recognitions, you have to have a backbone who you do and don't recognize and not let China muscle you. The EU's role, they need to get back to their standards and policy. When we talk about gas, interconnector, railroad, their job is to set a common framework for Europe, and then they need to make sure that connects to Eurasia. Afghanistan, I've spent 2 years of my life there. I don't think the story is done. And don't forget about Iran in the equation. The NSS, it's not necessarily a bad thing not being called by name in it, but a lot of the topics and issues that involve the Central Asian states are in it. The role of China versus U.S. in critical minerals, we have those capabilities. I'll just use North Carolina. We have one of the largest lithium deposits in the world, and now the company in state to produce rare earth magnets. We just need some legislation to get around some of the environmentals and production. U.S. investment, we talk about that. That's great with DFC and all that. But industry at the end of the day, we need to create the mechanisms and the trade and the policy and all that. But the investment's going to come with industry. And on Jackson Vanik, I would say, it's a prioritization for Congress right now. We got to keep the government open, et cetera, et cetera. So WTO membership is still out there. Waivers are out there. So I would say from the Hill's perspective, it's a positive, but it's prioritization, what legislation gets passed when.
Okay, very good. Thanks, JC. Wes.
A bit of self-promotion. Ariel Cohen and I actually wrote a critical mineral strategy for the U.S. in Central Asia, and it is out at the Atlantic Council, and it has been out. So you can get that for a lot of our answers. Concerning the EU and investment in Central Asia, and should they take the lead or should we take the lead, and what should we do? The main problem America has competing with China is an inability to quickly move money into projects. China can go somewhere and say, we will build this multi-billion-dollar thing for you. The United States said, well, we can help, we can do investment. Yes, and they the U.S. needs some form of direct investment fund that it can at least give the foreign around money. So how this relates to the EU doesn't have this capacity either, and it is even more disjointed and bureaucratic because you have many different state actors futilely coordinating often some sort of EU policy. So if the US wants to remain relevant and it wants to prevent either a coalescence of Russian and Chinese or EU relations, some configuration that is not to our advantage, we need to be involved in Central Asia. We need to think about how we invest.
Thank you, Wes. Excellent. You'll have 15 seconds addition for Roger.
Yeah, no, it's first thing, yeah, Afghanistan, Russia, almost within 2 years was, you're still there, please get out. And I agree that story is not completed. There are still those of us interested in the country, and the neighborhood, I think, is a great place to start. Secondly, yes, get rid Jackson Vanik, and I would add Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act. These are wonderful obstacles to remove to create better trade routes in the region, and the latter one, particularly to help Armenia, Azerbaijan get along as discussed in a White House summit. Third point, finally, Europe and the Gulfies engaging in the region. I'm an advocate of the GCC. I think we need to look at the Gulf countries working in the region. Gulf investment in the region is important, but also the other way around. You're increasingly seeing Central Asian guest workers move to the Gulf, not to Russia. Conditions there are better. It's a little safer for them. And education. Increasingly Central Asian students going to GCC universities, especially branch campuses of American and British universities in the Gulf. Great education, and it's one-stop shopping or flights for mom and dad to send you there. And would you rather have your kid in Doha or in Tallahassee or Gainesville? And I think as a mom and dad, they're probably like, yeah, let's have them closer to home. So I see the relationship between the GCC and Central Asia as a fast-growing one this decade.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Daniel.
Yep. While globalization stumbles, I think regional economic integration is on the way up. The C5, C6 are ready made for that. Thank you for mentioning education. Education and technology are the path forward. And JC for Jackson Vanik, let's find some must-pass legislation to attach this rascal to. It'll never pass on its own.
All right. That was terrific. All right.
You get a comment.
I am going to have a last comment. And it's kind of inspired by your question, although I won't talk about technology because I really don't know that much about it, except that it is a huge comparative advantage for us. And it is the backbone of so much of economic activity. If I were writing the national security strategy, we can call this the Cutchins corollary rather than the Trump corollary. I would have channeled a different president, although I'm good with the Monroe Doctrine and Teddy Roosevelt, but I would look into the 1920s and the one president who was a graduate of my alma mater, Amherst College, Calvin Coolidge. The business of America is business. I mean, that is what we do best. And when 10, 11, 12, 13 years ago, when I was very active in the region of Central Asia, and our conclusion from a project, our main recommendation, what everybody was telling us from every country, even including Turkmenistan, what did they want to see more of? They wanted to see more American private sector engagement with the region and to balance the security relationship with that. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you. Fantastic. Good job, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Really
really
enjoyed it.